Hi, welcome to part 1 of the online lecture series for the Maryland IEP document. This lecture is the first of 2 audio screencasts designed to familiarize you with the IEP in the state of Maryland. While this tutorial does focus on the Maryland document, the federal law IDEA mandates that certain content be contained in all IEPs. So if you find yourself teaching in another state, you will likely find this content to look very similar. However, each state does have its own regulations. In Maryland, these are called COMAR. So some of the specific questions or formatting on this document will be unique to Maryland. During the course of this lecture, we'll be utilizing 2 resources that are both available to you in the online module. One is the Maryland Online IEP PowerPoint presentation that looks like this. And this PowerPoint presentation has some basic information about each section of the IEP document. You'll also notice on each of the slides of the PowerPoint presentation that you'll find a corresponding page number that will tell you which page of the IEP this slide is referencing so that you can follow along. And then we'll also be using the PDF version of the Maryland IEP document. And as we go through, I'll be pointing to things, highlighting things for you so that you can feel clear about what each box or each text field is supposed to designate on the IEP. Both parts of the IEP online lectures are designed to provide you with the foundation of this IEP document. After you watch this module, you will have an opportunity to participate in class applications where you will develop specific sections of an IEP, and you will have the opportunity to discuss this IEP and the IEP team process much more in depth with your instructor. One of the benefits of having this online lecture is that you can go back, rewind, even revisit portions of this lecture again later as you're developing an actual IEP. If you find yourself in the future working as a special educator in the field, we know you will have many opportunities to work with the IEP. But we hope that this gives you a solid foundation as you begin to develop your skill set. If you are detail-oriented, adhere to the guidelines for development, and most of all, if you learn to craft a document that is very individualized to the need of your student, you will no doubt excel at creating IEPs. So now, let's get started. It's also important for you to mention that all of the content from this lecture presentation has been taken directly from the Maryland Statewide IEP Process Guide that was developed by the Maryland State Department of Education and most recently revised on July 1st, 2014, and you'll see the information for that source at the very end of this PowerPoint presentation. So first beginning, if you are referencing your PDF document, which by the way you may find helpful to download or print so that you can make notes for yourself on the document. I guarantee that will help you later when you are developing the document either for your assignment for this course or as part of your work in the internship or in the field. I think that you'll find that helpful. So page 1 contains student information, and that's broken down into 3 parts: student and school information, exit information, and IEP team participants. So let's take a look at that now. So you see that the IEP document is pretty clear. You'll note that there are headings throughout the document that delineate the different sections. So the majority of the cover sheet is student and school demographic information. Below that you have exit information. This may not apply to all students, but we'll talk in just a minute about what that is. And then your IEP team participants. So if you take a look at the top right-hand portion of the IEP, you'll notice that each IEP document may have one of 3 statuses or 3 options to identify the document. The first of these options is a draft. A draft is a proposed program for development, review, or revision by the IEP team at the IEP team meeting. And so it is just that. It is a draft. It is a proposed version of the services and supports that the IEP team believes the student may need, but it is in no way indicative of decisions that have been made. In fact, draft IEPs may even have skeletal information in them and have portions that need to be completed at the meeting, as that is part of the IEP team process. And so if the IEP is checked draft, there will be a date that will coincide with that. An approved IEP is an IEP that has been developed, reviewed, or revised by an IEP team, and it delineates the student's program of services. And so it is indeed the outcome of the IEP team meeting. And then an amended IEP is an IEP that's had changes made to it, either by creating an addendum or revising the actual IEP document. And amendments to the IEP may happen at any time during the course of an IEP. We know from IDEA that the IEP team is required to meet at least annually to review an IEP, but certainly the IEP team may come together more frequently to make amendments. So as you continue to look down this side of the page, you'll notice that student demographic information is here on the left-hand side. The student's name, address, all of the other unique information about the student, the local ID number that's been assigned by the local school system, the date of birth, the age, the gender, and the race. If the student is a limited English speaker, that is also designated here, as well as the schools and the county that is providing service or fiscally responsible for the student. If the student has a parent surrogate who is acting in regard to their educational rights instead of a parent or a guardian, then that information is also indicated here. And on the right side of the screen, you'll see the parent's contact information here. It's important for the case manager of the student. Typically, this is the special educator. Sometimes if it's a student with a speech and language impairment, it may be the speech and language pathologist. In other more rare instances, it may be another professional, but for the most part, it tends to be on the responsibility of the case manager who is developing the IEP to review the student's demographic information and the parent's contact information to make sure that it's accurate. And this is an important job. You always want to make sure that you're ensuring the accuracy of this data here at least annually. And then the name of the case manager is indicated on the right side. And then we have some areas for dates. So if we talk just a minute about dates, we know that the annual review is annual. And so if the annual review date is today, let's say if it's September 1st, 2014, then we would enter that here, September 1st, 2014, as the annual review date. And then our projected annual review date would be 1 calendar year after the annual review. So in this case, we would say September 1st, 2015. The most recent evaluation date is just that. The most recent evaluation date indicates the most recent evaluation date indicates the date that the student's IEP team met to consider existing data, information from parents, or additional data to complete the evaluation of the student to determine whether or not they were eligible or continued to be eligible for special education services. So let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that for this student the most recent evaluation date was May 30th, 2014. And so when we are considering the projected evaluation date, we would select a date that is 3 calendar years away from the most recent evaluation. So May 30th, 2014, then we would indicate that the projected evaluation date is May 30th, 2017. And the student's primary disability is also listed on the cover sheet of the IEP, and the primary disability will coincide with the federal census code that is categorized under IDEA. So it is going to be a broad category of disability that best describes the student's needs. Now the next section of the cover sheet is the exit information, and this may not apply to all students, particularly for those of you who are going to be working with very young students. So there's a variety of reasons that students may exit special education, and some of those reasons are listed here. So if the student is exiting special education because, and reason A here is that they're returning to general education, and potentially in that situation, the IEP team may have determined that as a result of having met the objectives on his or her IEP, the student is no longer eligible for special education services and no longer needs the services that are outlined on the IEP. So after an assessment to determine that, the team may determine that the child is returning to general education. So we would enter the date that they're exiting, or there's a variety of other reasons here that children may exit, namely they graduate from high school, or they move, or there are some other special cases listed here. And the third and final portion of the cover sheet, or the student information section of the IEP, is the IEP team participants. And so in this section, you will list those who have participated in the IEP team meeting, and you'll list the role of the individual as well as their name. And then each individual will also sign the cover sheet of the approved IEP. So as we move now to the next section of the IEP, we're going to be looking at pages 2 and 3 of the PDF document and talking about the eligibility section. So there's several different types of eligibility sections that may appear in your student's IEP. If the student for whom you're developing the document, if it is their initial IEP, then you will see the initial eligibility section. And this section will very closely analyze whether the assessment timelines were met during the evaluation process, in addition to some of the other typical information that we look at in terms of whether or not the child is eligible for special education. And then if it is not the IEP, the initial IEP, then this section will be called continued eligibility. And as you're developing the Maryland State IEP online, there's actually a checkoff box on the cover sheet that allows you to indicate whether or not it's the initial IEP. And based on that selection, that's how your software system will determine which section you see. So if we go on to page 2 of the PDF document, you'll see that initial eligibility, which starts on page 2 and continues onto page 3, is much longer than what we see when we look at continued eligibility. And so let's take a look actually at continued eligibility first. So in this section of the IEP, you're really documenting the areas that the team evaluated or re-evaluated the student, why you evaluated the student in those areas, when you evaluated the student, which is your evaluation date, month, day, year. And then you're answering a series of questions. Does the student continue to have a disability that requires special education and related services? And are there additional or additions or modifications that are needed on the IEP to support the student in meeting their annual goals? And so you'll answer each of those questions, determine whether or not they're eligible, and then again, indicate the primary disability of the student. The initial evaluation eligibility data is really much more specific because it's taking the team very carefully through the process of identifying the child. So you see some of the same questions here as you saw before, but you also see some more specific information, particularly this section right here that I'd like to highlight for you. Is a determinant factor for the student's lack of academic progress the result of a lack of appropriate instruction in reading, math? Or is the lack of progress a result of limited English proficiency? And so these are things that IDEA really asks the IEP team to rule out when they're considering whether or not a student has an educational disability under IDEA, and certainly important factors for the team to consider here. Moving down this page, you'll see a location to enter the date of parental consent for initial evaluation. Remember that the IEP team has 60 days from the time of parental consent to the time where they review the evaluation with the IEP team. And so you'll see here in this first box the line to indicate the date of parental consent, and then the line below. So ideally we would see not more than 60 days in between those two, 60 calendar days in between those two dates. Additionally, the school district has to complete the evaluation within 90 days of receiving the initial referral. But don't worry about that for now. For now, just keep focused on the fact that the IEP team has 60 days from the time of parental consent to the time when they complete the assessments. And of course, if we're living in the land of continued eligibility, we know that the IEP team has 90 days to complete that reevaluation. So again, 90 days for continued eligibility and 60 days for initial. If for any reason there was a delay in those 60 days, the initial eligibility section of the IEP actually gives quite an extensive area for team members to document the reason for delay. And it's important to note here that this really is for documentation purposes. IDEA is very clear about the student-centered aspects of service. And so we want to make sure that we're following those timelines so that we give our students with suspected disabilities every benefit of the doubt to receive those services if in fact they become eligible. So don't mistake documenting a reason for delay as being permissible to go beyond the timeline. It's still important to stay within the timeline, but if for some reason that is not adhered to, that data is collected here very, very carefully, and so you want to be sure that you indicate that. Before we move on to the next section of our IEP, I just want to be clear about the options that parents have prior to age 3 or upon age 3 when they provide initial consent for early intervention services. So before the age of 3, if a child with a current IFSP is determined to be eligible for special education related services, the child's family may choose from one of two options. Their first option is to extend the IFSP, and that is an option provided in the state of Maryland. The child and the family would continue to receive early intervention services with an educational component that promotes school readiness, pre-literacy, language, numeracy skills through an IFSP until the beginning of the school year following the child's 4th birthday. So that's the first option. The family may extend the IFSP, or special education preschool services may be provided through an IEP. So moving on now to the next section of the IEP, we're going to take a look at the district, statewide assessments, and graduation section of the IEP, and that is found on pages 4 and 5 of your IEP PDF document. The main purpose of this section of the IEP is to outline the student's assessment pathway. In this case, in the state of Maryland, students may work toward a diploma or a certificate of program completion. And so this section will outline how the student, or plan for how we anticipate the student to exit high school, or the plan that they're working toward. And it will also contain the student's scores on required standardized assessments. So as we take a look here, we'll notice, and this section actually has had considerable revision lately based on the changes that have been happening with our state assessment. As you know, we're in the process of transitioning from the MSA, the Maryland School Assessment, and the HSA, High School Assessment, to the PARCC assessments. And so you'll see that some of the language for the assessment here has been updated on the IEP. So if you've worked with IEP documents in the past, you'll notice that this section looks a bit different. So know that the regulations are that each principal shall inform all students and their parents or their guardians annually at a minimum of the following. So they should inform them of Maryland's graduation requirements. They should discuss the student's progress toward fulfilling credits, participation in the high school assessment if they're older, or application or applicable IEP requirements that they need for graduation. In addition, the parents or the guardians should also receive the results of the HSA if children have taken the HSA. And if we determine that we believe that students may not be eligible for graduation, we need to have some sort of assistance plan in place if we anticipate that that may not happen. And so while many of you may be working with very young students, it's still important not to completely defer this idea of whether the student is working toward a diploma or a program, a certificate of program completion, because in some ways that will delineate the opportunities that we provide for the students. And it's important also to know that it really is a very small percentage of students who are working toward a high school certificate of program completion, and certainly are students with the most significant disabilities. So there's area on the IEP for the IEP team members to indicate whether all of those things have happened. So did we state the graduation requirements? Did we explain the graduation requirements to parents? When children are very young, this may simply be referring parents to resources, even online resources or other resources provided by the school system where they can get some information about eligibility for graduation. It's never too young to help parents to be informed about that. And for many parents, this could be a source of anxiety or even curiosity about what is ahead for their child. And so don't discount the importance of doing that. And then this box indicates whether or not the child will participate in the MSA or the HSA. And then down below further, there's an area for the IEP team to indicate whether the student will participate in the PARCC assessments for grades 3 through 8. or whether they'll participate in the PARCC assessments in English, algebra, geometry for high school, as well as a place to document the decision. And while we aren't necessarily going to go into great detail here about determining a student's assessment pathway, certainly know that a best practice for making that decision as to whether or not the student is pursuing a diploma or a certificate is best made by looking at some of those decision-making tools within the Maryland Accommodations Manual. And a link to that will be available in the second part, the second screencast of this lecture series. The second portion of the district and statewide assessments gives an indication of how the student has performed on past assessments. And so you can see here that if the student has taken the MSA beginning in the 3rd grade, you'll see whether or not they've scored basic, proficient, or advanced. If they've participated in the Alt MSA, which is our alternate assessment here in Maryland, you will also see their performance related to the percentage of mastery for their mastery objectives and whether or not they've earned basic, proficient, or advanced in each of those tested areas as well. And also you'll see for future years an indication of how students have performed on the performance-based assessments for PARCC, as well as the end-of-the-year assessments that are part of the PARCC assessment series. So moving now to the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, sometimes known as the PLAF section of the IEP. I know it's such a terrible acronym and quite a mouthful, but we'll try to refer to it here as the present level section, which is found on pages 6 and 7 of your IEP document. And so IDEA indicates that in developing each student's IEP, that the IEP team should consider the strengths of the student, the concerns of the parents for enhancing the education of their child, the results of the initial evaluation or the most recent evaluation, and then the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the student. And so this section, the present level section of the IEP, really is where a lot of that is captured. Questionably, this is one of the most important sections of the IEP because it provides a picture of the student's strengths and needs based on the assessment data, most specifically based on the most recent assessment data. So all information provided in the present level section of the IEP must have data to support it. You don't want to be making statements about a child's performance in this section without qualifying data to support it. And each need that's identified in this section will eventually lead to a goal, a support, or a service that's outlined in another section of the IEP, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So the present level section of the IEP, the way that it presents in this blank document is rather stark looking, but there's quite a bit of information that will go into this section. And again, each individual or each professional who conducts their evaluation or conducts their evaluation with another professional as part of the team, because we love that collaboration in the evaluation process, will contribute to this section of the IEP. And so, for example, if I am the special educator and I conduct an educational assessment using the Woodcock-Johnson, then I would complete this first section, which is the academic information. And so the source is where I'm going to indicate the source of the data that I use to assess the student. And so in this case, if I'm only indicating performance from the Woodcock-Johnson, then I would list the entire name of the Woodcock-Johnson test including the um, the in this case, if I was using the Woodcock-Johnson assessment, I would want to include the full name of that assessment as it appears within the assessment materials so that individuals who are reading this know exactly what edition I was using. And then the summary of assessment findings is where the evaluator will indicate quite a bit of information about the student. So the first thing they'll do is they'll summarize the assessment findings, and this typically happens in a short narrative, perhaps a paragraph, sometimes several paragraphs. But the assessment findings include data, including the date that the assessment was conducted, data and information from any assessments that were included in this process. And so let's assume for a second, because a best practice may be to conduct a formal assessment and an informal assessment. So I may list here the Woodcock-Johnson, and I may also list classroom-based assessments. And then over in my summary of assessment findings, I'm going to write a paragraph or two about the strengths and the needs of the student based on those assessments. So I may use information from, as we said, classroom-based assessments, formal assessments. I may use information from classroom-based observations, parent information if I can substantiate that with some data to support, student and general education teacher input in relevant areas. And so here is where I'm painting that picture of the child's strengths and their needs, which will then inform how I develop my goals in the IEP. And then I come to this question: does this area impact the student's academic achievement or functional performance? And in most cases here, you're going to answer yes, because later in the IEP, you're going to address this in some way. And then this section right here, sometimes confusing for folks who are developing the IEP, but the instructional grade level performance is where you indicate whether or not the student is performing on grade level. So if they're not performing on grade level, this may be an indicator that the student's IEP team needs to consider supplementary aids, services, program modifications, and supports. Although a student's performance may not be on grade level, though, it's important to remember that the student will continue to receive instruction in grade level content. So examples of things that you may see in instructional grade level performance: you may see a grade equivalent or an age equivalent in some cases, depending on the skills or the age of the child. So for example, you may see under instructional grade level performance that the student's reading level is at the 1.5 grade level. Or you may see down here in physical section, if we're talking about gross motor skills, you may see the level of performance indicated at 36 months age equivalent. And so those are just several examples that you may see here. Typically, the instructional grade level performance is some numerical information with perhaps a brief phrase to accompany it, while your summary of assessment findings tends to be a short narrative. The only sections of the PLAF that will appear on the student's IEP are the ones that are filled in. So you can see here you have the option to add information about the student in the areas of academic, health, physical, or behavioral needs. In addition to the information that we glean from assessments, we also look to gain parental input and include this information on the IEP. And so this is a section of the IEP that you really get to talk about the students' interest areas, their personal attributes, their accomplishments, what makes them who they are. And so this is really that place where you get to talk about the child as a person and not just as a student. So what is the parental input? And many educators will contact parents in advance of the meeting to seek their input, and this is certainly considered a best practice. And you have perhaps an opportunity for parents to provide some information for this first question, of course, probably the second question as well, although if you know the student, you can certainly add some items for this second question. And then this third question here is very, very important. This is something that you're going to want to highlight, star, put an asterisk next to in your notes. This is sometimes referred to as the impact statement on the IEP. How does the student's disability affect his or her involvement in the general education curriculum? And so sometimes I think it's helpful to think of this in terms of an if-then statement. If there is a concern, then what is the impact on the student's participation? In other words, if this student did not have this IEP, if they did not have any special education supports or services or related services, what would be the impact to the student? How would the student participate or not be able to participate in the general education curriculum? And so typically in a couple of sentences, you can articulate that in a way that really clarifies the impact of the child's disability on his or her education. And then for preschool students, you're going to talk about how the disability affects their participation in appropriate activities. And we know that when we're talking about young children, we are talking about their developmental levels, their social, emotional development. We're also talking about that with older children. But with preschool children, it's important for us to look at that in a little bit more holistic way because the areas of development are so intertwined with academic skills. And so this question is worded in a slightly different way for young children. The last section of the IEP that we'll be taking a look at in this lecture is the special considerations section, which is actually made up of special considerations is also inclusive of accommodations, but because accommodations are such an important component, we'll be saving that until the second portion of our lecture. So now we're just going to talk about what the IEP team, or what the IEP terms special considerations. And so the main areas are communication and assistive technology. And then for those students for whom it is relevant, we may also be looking at services to support children who are blind or visually impaired, to support those who are deaf and hard of hearing, or behavioral interventions for students with limited English proficiency. And so there's quite a bit covered in this section. So as we take a look at this, which begins on page 8, we see that the first question that you're asked to consider is, does the child have special communication needs? And so if yes, you'll answer yes, and then indicate what those needs are. So if it happens to be, and you'll do that in a narrative format, typically fairly brief, maybe a sentence, several sentences, a short paragraph. You may talk about a student who needs visual supports, or a student who uses sign language, or a student who needs a schedule, or some other sort of very specific information related to communicating their wants and their needs. Could be for a student who has a more significant disability, or it could be for a student who just has some very particular and specific special communication needs who's at a higher level. So you want to think holistically about this question so that you can help the next IEP team or the next set of service providers really have a clear understanding of how the child communicates, because that is essential to learning. And the assistive technology section is also a consideration. And again, the communication section and the assistive technology section must be considered at least annually. by the IEP team, even if the student has not had information included here before, the IEP team always needs to consider whether or not this is relevant at the time. So the IEP team will consider whether an assistive technology device or service is needed to increase, maintain, or improve the capabilities of the student. And if the IEP team answers yes, then the next step is to identify how the use of the assistive tech device will be addressed. So will it be addressed through here supplementary aids and services, related services, or accommodations? And so there's also an area here to document the basis for decision, which in this case is required. And so documenting the basis for decision really is just that. It's to discuss why and how the IEP team came upon the decision that they did in completing some of this information just above. If the student is blind or visually impaired, then there's a series of questions here that the team is asked to consider with regard to whether or not the student may be eligible or appropriate for instruction in Braille. And there's also some information as well to consider whether or not services for students who are deaf or hearing impaired may include information, whether or not the parents have been included This next section asks the IEP team to consider for students who are deaf or hearing impaired whether or not the language, the communication needs of the child have provided opportunities for direct communication, academic level, full range of needs, including direct instruction in the child's language and communication mode. And so really the IEP team is asked to consider the child's mode of communication and whether or not the parents have been provided information about Maryland School for the Deaf. And these last two sections of the special consideration section ask the IEP team to consider behavioral interventions for the student. So in the case of a student whose behavior impedes this learning or that of others, the IEP team should consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports, or other strategies that address that behavior. If that is the case, then a functional behavioral assessment must be conducted. So if an IEP or if an FBA has been addressed or has been conducted to address some of those inappropriate behaviors, then the most recent date of the FBA will be contained in this first box, and then the date for the behavior intervention plan, or the date when the behavior intervention plan was implemented, would be listed directly below. And typically, if you revise the behavior intervention plan, then you would revise the date that's listed here as well. And then this documentation for basis of decision immediately below is also a required section. And so this is a good place to talk about why the student may have required an FBA and BIP, highlight some of those very key strategies on the behavior intervention plan to support its inclusion or its use to support the inclusion of the student. And then for students who are limited English speakers, the IEP team is also asked to consider the language needs of the student and to document some of the information related to the student's language needs. So thank you for your attention. This concludes the first portion of our online lecture for the IEP. We encourage you to take a few moments to look over your notes, make a list of any questions or outstanding information that you'd like to know about any of these particular sections that will help you to be able to develop them in the future so that we can talk about those in class. and good luck on the quiz.